I was wandering through the supermarket that afternoon, moving slower than I once did. The hum of the coolers and the distant chatter of young families filling the air around me. My knees ached the way old knees do, but it was a pleasant kind of ache, the reminder that you've walked a long road. Then, in one of those fancy aisles they call artisanal these days, my eyes caught something that stopped me in my tracks. A row of jars, golden and glimmering under the fluorescent light. Labels read, "Local Raw Honey, Wildflower Blend, Clover Harvest." For a moment, I just stood there, hand on the cart, staring at those jars as if they were ghosts from another lifetime. A smell seemed to rise in my memory. Sweet, floral, thick with summer heat, the smell of my youth, of my work, of my life as a beekeeper. Funny thing about memory, it sneaks up on you, soft as the buzz of wings on a July morning. One moment, you're an old man in a store, the next, you're a barefoot boy in America, chasing fireflies in the fields of your hometown, your father's voice calling you back before supper. That jar of honey wasn't just honey to me, it was the doorway back to the hives I built with my own hands, the sweat-soaked summers when the air smelled of clover and smoke, the sting of bees on my skin, and the taste of fresh comb pulled straight from the frame. It was friendships forged in the hum of apiaries, betrayals that cut deeper than stingers, nights I spent aching with loss, mornings where the first light made the honey glow like liquid gold. I leaned on the cart and let the wave of it take me. At 65, the years weigh heavy, but memories, good and bad, carry a sweetness that no sugar can match. That honey jar reminded me I was not just a man who lived through the noise of America's changes. I was a man who kept bees, who walked alongside them, who understood their language, and in some strange way became a little like them, hardworking, patient, and always returning home. So there, in the middle of that supermarket aisle with strangers brushing past and carts rattling, I began to remember. And what came was not just memory, it was my life, from boyhood to the long road of work, love, disappointment, and gratitude. And it all began, as many things do, with a boy staring at the wild flowers of an American summer, listening to the hum that would one day shape his entire life. I must have been no more than 8 years old the first time I really noticed the bees. I remember it clear as day, the summer of '66, back when the air in small-town America carried the smell of cut grass, diesel from passing tractors, and pies cooling on neighbors' windowsills. The world felt slower then, though maybe that's just how childhood is remembered. Behind our house stretched a meadow that turned golden every June, a quilt of clover, wildflowers, and Queen Anne's lace. It was there I'd spend afternoons barefoot, my shirt sticking to me in the heat, chasing grasshoppers or lying on my back to watch clouds drift. But more than anything, I remember the sound. The low, steady hum of bees, moving from bloom to bloom, busy as little engines, patient as old men playing chess. Most kids were scared of them. I wasn't. I was fascinated. I'd crouch close to the blossoms, careful not to spook them, and just watch. The way they seemed to know exactly where to go, how they carried tiny baskets of pollen on their legs like sacks of gold. I thought of them as little workers, each with a job, a rhythm, a purpose. And maybe even back then, I wanted a life like that. Honest, steady, useful. My grandfather had a single
School friends didn't understand why I bothered. While they were hanging out at the diner, I was lugging boxes of supers, sweating under the July sun, smelling of smoke and wildflowers. But I didn't mind. There was something grounding in it. The bees didn't care about high school gossip or who was dating who. They cared about survival, about order, about doing the work that needed to be done. I remember my first real harvest. I brought a few jars of honey to church for the bake sale, nervous as anything. Folks tried it, and their faces lit up. They asked me if it was really mine, if I had raised the bees myself. When I nodded, pride flickered in my chest, warmer than the summer air. That was the first time I understood this work wasn't just about bees or honey. It was about giving something pure, something needed, to others. By the time I was 16, I had saved up enough to buy a second hive, then a third. My weekends were filled with tending, building frames, painting boxes, hauling buckets sticky with honey. It wasn't the life of most American teens in the late 70s, but it was mine. Looking back now, I think those years taught me more than any classroom could. Responsibility, patience, respect for nature, and maybe most of all, the quiet joy of working with something bigger than yourself. Graduation came in 1976, the bicentennial year. America was draped in red, white, and blue. Fireworks lit up every small town. And there I was, an 18-year-old kid in a pressed shirt, diploma in hand, trying to figure out what came next. Most of my friends talked about heading to college, the city, the military, or the factories that still roared in those days. Me? I couldn't picture myself anywhere but among the fields and hives. The bees had gotten under my skin, deeper than a sting. They weren't just a hobby anymore. They were a calling. Still, it wasn't simple. Beekeeping wasn't exactly a booming career in small-town America. My father wanted me to find something steady, something with a paycheck every Friday. My mother worried I'd spend my life chasing a dream too fragile to last. And, truth be told, I worried too. Bees were unpredictable. Weather, mites, chemicals in the crops, all of it could wipe out a season overnight. But when I thought about walking away, my chest tightened. The thought of leaving the hum of the hives, the smell of wax and smoke, the sight of golden comb glistening in the morning light, it was like imagining a world without sunlight. So I struck a compromise. I enrolled in community college part-time, studying agriculture and biology while expanding my hives on the side. Those were lean years. My first truck was an old Ford with a busted tailgate, always rattling, always smelling of gasoline and honey. I'd haul boxes, tools, jars, everything I needed to scrape by. I took odd jobs, too, hauling hay for farmers, fixing fences, even washing dishes at the diner. Every dollar went back into the bees. I built more hives, painted them by hand, and learned how to split colonies, how to rear queens, how to bottle and label honey that I could sell at farmers markets. I'll never forget my first booth at the county fair. I had a folding table, a homemade sign, and a dozen jars lined up in neat rows. People stopped, tasted, smiled. Kids licked sticky fingers. Old-timers nodded in approval. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could make a life out of this. But it wasn't just work. It was life happening all around me. Those years held my first love, too. A girl named Linda, who lived 2 towns over. She loved the wildflowers, the long rides in my old truck, the way I smelled faintly of smoke and sweetness.
We'd sit on the hood at dusk, fireflies rising all around, and talk about the future as if it were something we could simply order up. And yet, reality has a way of testing young men. Money was tight. Linda's dreams leaned toward city lights and college degrees, while mine leaned toward hives and fields. Eventually, the distance grew. One summer night, she told me she was leaving for Chicago. I kissed her goodbye under the streetlight, the taste of honey still on my lips, and let her go. That was my first real heartbreak. But the bees, they didn't let me wallow. They still needed tending, no matter how heavy my chest felt. And in that way, they taught me my first lesson about resilience. Life stings, but it also gives sweetness. If you keep working, keep showing up. Those early adult years were a crucible. I was young, unsteady, often uncertain, but each season with the bees shaped me, teaching me how to balance risk and reward, loss and gain, loneliness and belonging. And slowly, without realizing it, I was becoming not just a boy with hives, but a beekeeper. My 20s were a blur of sweat, smoke, and long days that stretched into nights. By then, I wasn't just the kid with a few hives anymore.
Still, there were high points too. The first time I pulled in a harvest big enough to pay all my bills, rent, truck repairs, groceries, and still have some left over, I felt 10 feet tall. Customers came back to me year after year, swearing my honey was richer, smoother, more real than anything in the stores. One old woman hugged me once at the market, saying my honey had soothed her husband's cough better than any medicine. That kind of gratitude, it stays with you. And then, in those years, came new love. Her name was Susan. She didn't mind the bees, didn't mind the long hours, or the fact that I came home smelling like smoke and wildflowers. She had a laugh that made me forget the stings, the worry, the losses. We met at a church picnic. I was selling jars at a little booth, she was pouring lemonade. By the end of the afternoon, I'd traded her a pint of honey for her phone number. Best trade I ever made. Life was far from easy. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if I'd made a mistake hitching my whole future to creatures with wings. But each morning, when the sun rose and the meadow came alive with buzzing, I felt the same pull I'd felt as a barefoot boy. I wasn't just keeping bees anymore. I was building a life, with my hands, my heart, and the hum of thousands of wings carrying me forward. Marriage came in '82, a warm June afternoon under a small white steeple. Susan walked down the aisle with flowers in her hair and sunlight streaming through the stained glass, and I remember thinking she looked like the very spirit of summer. My hands shook as I slipped the ring on her finger, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of joy. We didn't have much in those days. A rented house farm, an old couch, hand-me-down pots and pans. But we had each other, and we had the bees. Susan stood by me through it all. Suitcases of sticky jars hauled into county fairs, long nights extracting honey in a dimly lit shed, the hum of the extractor filling the air like a hymn. She'd sit with me at the kitchen table, labeling jars by hand, her handwriting neat and careful, mine smudged and hurried. Kids came soon after that. Our first son, Daniel, arrived in '84. I still remember the day I brought him home and held him near the window, the bees buzzing just outside. I whispered to him, half a prayer, half a promise. The world's full of sweetness, son. You just have to work for it. Life got busier then. Susan balancing babies on her hip, me balancing supers of honey on mine. I'd rise before dawn, check the hives, feed the bees if the nectar was thin, then head off to my day job, because yes, I still needed one.
Beekeeping paid some bills, but not all. For a while I worked construction, my hands calloused from both lumber and frames, my back stiff from lifting bricks and bee boxes alike. But every free hour I was back with the hives. Daniel toddled after me as soon as he could walk, curious about everything. Later, our daughter Emily joined him, her laughter ringing across the fields as she tried to chase butterflies while I worked the bees. Those years were a mix of exhaustion and magic. I'd come home after a long day, collapse into a chair, and Susan would hand me a plate of meatloaf or fried chicken, the smell filling our little kitchen. The house was loud with babies, sticky with honey, cluttered with toys and bee gear, but it was ours. There were hard moments, too. Colonies died. Crops were sprayed with chemicals that wiped out whole yards of bees overnight. Money was tight more often than not, and Susan and I argued sometimes about whether I should give up the bees, get a steady job, as she put it. But deep down, she knew, and I knew. I couldn't. It wasn't just work. It was who I was. And there were moments of such sweetness, I'd never trade them for anything. Like the summer night we set up a picnic blanket under the stars, the kids asleep inside, a jar of fresh honey between us, dipping spoons and laughing about nothing. Or the mornings when I carried Emily on my shoulders out to the hives, her little hands gripping my hair, her eyes wide with wonder at the golden frames. Looking back, those years were when the rhythm of my life fully fused with the rhythm of the bees. Work and family, loss and gain, sting and sweetness, all woven together in the same hum. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. By the late 80s, I'd grown from a handful of hives to nearly 200. What started as a boy's fascination had turned into a full-fledged business. My little honey stand at the county fair became contracts with grocers, health food stores, and even a few restaurants. I was proud, but also stretched thin. Beekeeping isn't romantic when you're running that many hives. It's sweat and risk stacked high on your shoulders. Moving colonies at night, your truck headlights cutting through fields while bees thudded against your veil. Waking at dawn to load supers so heavy that they bent your back. Driving miles to pollinate orchards, hives rattling in the trailer behind you, praying you wouldn't lose half of them on a sharp turn. But what hit hardest were the changes creeping into the industry. Chemicals in farming grew stronger, wiping out forage and poisoning bees. Diseases spread, mites especially, tiny killers that crawled into hives and turned them weak. Some seasons I'd lose 30% of my colonies. That kind of loss wasn't just numbers on paper. It was like burying friends. And yet, I kept pushing. I hired help, young guys looking for summer work, men who thought bees would be an easy gig until they got their first sting on the lip. Some stuck around, became brothers to me in the fields. Others left after a week, muttering curses as they peeled off their veils. One, though, cut deep. His name was Frank, a wiry fellow with quick hands and a quick smile. I trusted him, let him help with harvests, even split profits when times were good. He learned fast, maybe too fast. By the next spring, he'd struck out on his own, using my contacts, my tricks, even setting hives on fields I'd secured. I felt gutted, betrayed, like someone had stolen not just my business, but a piece of my soul.
Susan was my anchor in those days. She'd sit with me at the kitchen table, ledger books open, coffee gone cold, as I tried to figure out how to stay afloat. "Don't let it eat you," she'd say softly, her hand over mine. "The bees don't quick, and neither do you." But I won't lie, there were nights I lay awake, wondering if she was wrong. The kids were getting older, needs were bigger, bills stacked higher. I watched other men clock in and out at steady jobs, pensions waiting, security on the horizon, and I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake tying my future to creatures so fragile. And yet, every time I stepped back into the apiary, the doubt melted. The sound of thousands of wings rising together, it was church to me. The smell of honey warm in the comb, the sight of workers dancing their secret maps, it steadied me. The bees didn't give up, even in the face of loss. They rebuilt, repopulated, pushed forward. So, I followed their lead. By the early 90s, I'd weathered the storms, hardened by betrayal and softened by gratitude. My honey had a name in the region. People sought it out, saying they could taste something different, something honest in it. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was all the sweat, heartbreak, and stubbornness that flavored it. Still, the world was changing fast, and with each passing year, I could feel the weight of time pressing down, reminding me that nothing, not even bees, stays the same forever. The mid-90s rolled in like a storm front, loud, fast, and full of change. My kids were teenagers by then, Daniel tall and restless, Emily sharp as a tack, her eyes always searching for more than what our small town could offer. They didn't see the romance in bees the way I once had. To them, the hives were just Dad's work, sticky, hot, buzzing chores that took him away when other fathers seemed to be home. I tried to rope them in. Daniel came with me a few summers, hauling supers and puffing the smoker, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. He wanted ball games, cars, and Friday nights with friends, not Saturday mornings sweating in a bee suit. Emily helped Susan at the market stall sometimes, smiling at customers, but she confessed once that the smell of beeswax clung to her hair and made her feel different from other girls. It stung, I won't lie. I dreamed of passing this life on, of seeing one of them step into my boots, carrying the hum of the hives into another generation. But as the bees taught me, holding on too tight suffocates the colony. I had to let them fly their own paths. The business itself was shifting too. Farmers started cutting back on wild clover and alfalfa, planting corn and soybeans instead. The nectar sources dried up, and every season felt like a gamble. Then came the rise of cheap, imported honey, flooding the shelves at half my price. It burned me to see golden jars labeled pure, when I knew half of them were cut with syrup, their sweetness hollow compared to the real thing. To survive, I adapted. I leaned harder into local markets, branding my honey not as cheap sweetness, but as ours. I bottled it in glass instead of plastic, tied little ribbons, called it farm to table before that phrase was popular. Customers came back, not just for the taste, but for the story, for the sense of buying something made with hands, not machines. Those years were also when Susan carried more of the load than I sometimes admitted. She kept the books balanced, the house in order, the kids steady while I was chasing bees across counties. We had arguments, loud ones sometimes. She wanted me home more, wanted dinners without me nodding off at the table, wanted vacations that didn't revolve around honey harvests. And truth is, I wanted that too. But the bees demanded their due, and I was too stubborn to let go. And yet, there were bright spots. I remember one fall evening, the four of us at the county fair. Daniel was flirting with some girl near the Ferris wheel, Emily was eating cotton candy, and Susan and I sat on a bench watching the lights blink against the night sky. For a moment, everything felt whole. My back ached, my hands were rough, but my family was there, laughing, alive. I didn't know then that those moments were slipping away faster than I realized. Kids grow up, bees die off, Markets shift. Life never stays still. But sitting here now, at 65, I can still hear the laughter of my children mixed with the hum of bees in late summer. That's how memory works. It stitches the sweetness right alongside the sting. The early 2000s were a strange season of life. On paper, I was thriving. My honey was in specialty shops across 3 states. I'd built a reputation. People asked for me by name at farmers markets, and a couple of city restaurants wanted my honey on their menus. From the outside, it looked like I had made it. But at home, the hive felt emptier. Daniel left first, off to college, then straight into a tech job that had him tapping at keyboards instead of lifting boxes. I was proud, of course. I'd always told him to chase what set his soul on fire. But the house grew quieter without his footsteps thumping the stairs. Emily followed not long after, chasing dreams of art in a city that never slept. I still remember watching her car disappear down the gravel road, a lump in my throat as if part of me had driven away with her. Susan and I were suddenly alone again, like we'd rewound to the first years of marriage. Only this time, we weren't young dreamers. We were tired, worn from years of juggling bees and bills. She wanted weekends away, evenings just for us, maybe even a trip abroad. But my calendar was full of pollination contracts and harvest dates. Bees don't take vacations, I told her. And deep down, I feared if I slowed down, I'd lose everything I'd worked decades to build. The work itself was heavier too. Mites were worse than ever, and talk of colony collapse disorder started spreading through beekeepers like a dark whisper. Every spring I opened my hives with a pit in my stomach, not knowing how many would still be alive. Some mornings, the sight of empty boxes made me feel like I had failed them, like I had failed myself.
Yet there were flashes of light. I'd drive to deliver honey to a small-town grocery, and the owner's wife would tell me how her grandmother swore by my honey for her morning tea. Kids at fairs would grin, sticky hands clutching comb honey like treasure. People were grateful, genuinely grateful for the work I did. It mattered, even when it didn't feel like it. But the loneliness was there, buzzing under the surface. I'd work the hives in silence, the fields wide and empty, only the hum of bees for company. At night, Susan sometimes went to bed before me, tired of waiting, tired of the smell of smoke and beeswax clinging to my clothes. I'd sit at the kitchen table, a glass of bourbon in hand, wondering if this was what success was supposed to feel like. Still, I pressed on, because what else could I do? The bees had carried me this far, and though my children were gone, though Susan and I felt the quiet between us grow wider, I told myself the hum of the hives would fill it. Looking back now, I realized that was the beginning of me learning that even the strongest colony needs tending, or it drifts apart. The harshest years crept in slowly, like winter frost that you don't notice until the grass crunches beneath your boots. By the mid-2000s, my body was sending signals I didn't want to hear. My back, worn from decades of lifting supers, protested every time I bent to check a hive. My hands, once steady with frames, had started to tremble with arthritis, stiff in the mornings until I'd worked them loose. And the bees, Lord, the bees were struggling worse than ever. Colony collapse disorder wasn't just a headline anymore. It was in my own yard. Whole hives gone overnight. Nothing left but empty combs and silence. I'd crack open a lid, expecting the familiar roar, only to be met with stillness so heavy it made my chest ache. I buried more bees in those years than I care to count. Susan tried to hold me steady, but the truth is, our marriage showed its cracks too. We loved each other, always, but love doesn't erase loneliness. She'd ask me to come to church picnics, to weddings, to weekends at the lake with friends. More often than not, I stayed back, claiming the bees needed me. Maybe they did, but I think I also didn't know how to face life outside the veil anymore. I had grown so wrapped up in the hum of the hives that I forgot how to simply be a husband. I remember one evening in particular, summer twilight, the kitchen window open, fireflies blinking in the yard. Susan sat across the table, hands folded tight. "You're slipping away from me," she said. "You're here, but you're not here." Her voice was soft, but it cut deeper than any sting. I didn't know how to answer, so I just sat there, staring at the wood grain of the table, wishing I could promise her more than I had left to give. Meanwhile, the world sped past me. Supermarkets were full of organic this and artisan that, all mass-produced in factories far from the soil. Farmers I'd worked with for years were selling out, their land plowed under for development. Some of the old beekeepers I knew hung up their veils, sold their equipment, and walked away. "Too hard now. Not worth it anymore," they'd say. I couldn't bring myself to quit, though. Not then. Even as my body ached, even as Susan drifted further into her own world of book clubs and church committees, even as the bees themselves seemed to be slipping through my fingers, I held on. I told myself I wasn't ready to stop. That if I just worked harder, maybe I could fix it all. But deep down, in the quiet of those long nights, I felt it. The fear. The fear of becoming irrelevant, of being a man whose whole world had outgrown him. I'd see my kids, grown now, thriving in their cities, their clean clothes and polished lives, a world apart from my smoke-stained jacket. They were proud of me, I think, but I also knew they didn't understand me anymore. Maybe they never would. That's when I started to wonder, what happens when the hive is gone and all that's left is the keeper? It hit me suddenly, one cool spring morning in 2010. I was in the apiary, checking frames, when a sharp pain stabbed my chest. My hands trembled, my vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I might fall right there among the hives. Susan found me collapsed on the grass, honey still dripping from a frame I'd been lifting. The doctors called it a warning, a mild heart attack, they said. But to me, it felt like the universe tapping me on the shoulder, saying, "Slow down. You can't outrun time forever." I spent days in the hospital, Susan at my side, her hand never leaving mine. I watched the world move outside the window. Spring buds swelling on trees, the smell of rain on the asphalt, children playing in the yard down the street. Life kept moving, and yet I had been forced to stop. Recovering was a slow, humbling process. I couldn't lift the heavy frames. My back ached from sitting too long. Even bending over to inspect a hive made my chest tighten. For the first time, I truly understood that my body, like the bees I'd tended for decades, had limits. I couldn't push endlessly. Susan was gentle but firm. She said, "You've built something incredible. Now let it breathe. Let yourself breathe." Her words sank into me, though my stubbornness resisted. I'd always believed the work was me, and now I was terrified of losing both the hives and my identity at once. I started documenting everything: hive locations, bee behavior.
I began letting younger beekeepers help more, teaching instead of doing. Their hands weren't mine, but their enthusiasm reminded me of my own youth. The same awe I'd felt watching my grandfather lift that first frame of honey. The sting of betrayal, the ache of loss, the exhaustion of hard work, all of it could be softened if someone else learned from it. Slowly, I reconciled with the idea that stepping back didn't mean quitting. It meant passing on the hive and, in a strange way, keeping it alive forever. Even lying in bed at night, I could hear the hum of bees in my mind, a lullaby I'd known all my life. It was comforting. It reminded me that I had lived fully, that the sweetness and sting of my days had meaning. I realized, too, that Susan and I could reconnect, not through labor, but through shared memory, laughter, and quiet moments. The house might be quieter without the kids, the hives heavier with responsibility, but there was still warmth, still life, still love. That year taught me my first real lesson in letting go. To preserve what matters, sometimes you have to step back. By 2012, I had begun the slow dance of stepping back. Not leaving entirely, never that, but giving the younger generation more room to grow. Beekeeping had been my life, and I couldn't abandon it completely. Instead, I became a guide, a mentor, sharing the knowledge etched into my hands over decades. I started hosting small workshops at the apiary, inviting aspiring beekeepers to watch, ask, and learn. I showed them how to light the smoker just right, how to gently lift a frame without angering the hive, how to sense the subtle language of buzzing and dancing bees. Their wide eyes reminded me of my own youth, when I had first learned that patience and observation could turn chaos into order. Susan adjusted beautifully. She took over more of the day-to-day business, managing our local customers, the markets, and the bookkeeping. I watched her flourish in the role, realizing how much of our life together had always depended on her steadiness. My heart swelled with gratitude, and sometimes I caught myself just staring at her, remembering that summer afternoon when we'd first met, and thinking, we survived everything because of each other. The kids came home for visits, bringing their laughter, stories, and the inevitable mess that reminded me of quieter, younger days. Daniel would sometimes help in the fields, brushing off his suit jacket to lift a frame or two. Emily brought jars of honey back to the city with her, proudly showing off the little labels I'd taught her to make. The hive wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. It was theirs. It was a legacy. Those years weren't without sadness. Colonies still died, pests still snuck in, and some hives could never be saved. I grieved each loss, just as I had always done, but the sting didn't feel quite as sharp. My perspective had shifted. Life had taught me that loss and gain existed together, that sweetness and sting always came in tandem. Evenings were quieter now. Susan and I would sit on the porch after dinner, the sun slipping below the horizon, a gentle breeze carrying the faint hum of the hives in the distance. Sometimes I would close my eyes and imagine the past decades flashing by, the boy with his first hive, the young man with a truck full of supers, the father guiding his children's hands over combs, the husband and mentor watching life unfold around him. And I felt a deep, unshakable contentment. My hands were still rough, my back still stiff, but my soul felt lighter than it had in years. The bees had given me everything: lessons in patience, resilience, gratitude, and love. I had given them care, attention, and respect in return. Together we had made something enduring. I began to understand fully that retirement wasn't an ending, it was another season, one where reflection, gratitude, and quiet joy could flourish, alongside the continued hum of a life well lived.
By 2015, I knew the end of my full-time beekeeping days was near. My body no longer allowed the long, punishing hours I once thrived on, and the bees, ever resilient, were in capable hands with the younger men and women I had trained. Yet, each hive I approached still carried the same pull it had in my youth. The soft vibration beneath my fingers, the smell of warm wax and honey, the whisper of wings like a living lullaby. The final harvest that year was bittersweet. I moved slowly through the fields, lifting frames with care, feeling the weight of both honey and years pressing into me. Each jar I bottled seemed heavier than before, not from the golden liquid alone, but from the memories it held. The first harvest, my children's sticky hands, the long nights of extracting and labeling, the laughter and tears of decades gone by. Customers came to the farm one last time for the grand harvest, some from towns I'd forgotten the names of, others from faraway cities who had tracked my honey for years. Faces I recognized, smiles I remembered, gratitude shining in their eyes. One elderly man said, "Son, I've tasted a lot of honey in my life, but yours, it carries something different." That simple statement hit me harder than any business deal or profit margin ever could. Susan stayed by my side throughout, her hand in mine as we moved between hives and barrels. We shared quiet laughter, whispered memories, and occasional tears, recollecting our early struggles, the joys of raising children amidst the buzzing, and the heartbreaks we had endured together. We had built a life, a family, a business, and a legacy, all intertwined with the hum of bees. As I set down the last frame, cleaned my smoker one final time, and closed the apiary gate, I felt a profound sense of completion. It wasn't sadness, it was fulfillment. I had lived fully, worked hard, loved deeply, and left something lasting behind. And as I watched the bees drift toward their hives in the late afternoon sun, I understood that life, much like the seasons of the apiary, comes in cycles. There is work, there is loss, there is sweetness, there is sting, and then there is rest. I knew, deep down, that stepping away didn't mean the end. The bees, the knowledge, and the love would continue, carried forward by those I had taught and by the family I cherished. And for the first time in decades, I felt a stillness that was both quiet and rich, filled with gratitude. Sitting on the porch that evening, watching the sun melt behind the hills, I let my mind drift over the decades. Childhood memories surfaced, like warm drafts of honey on a sunny afternoon. I remembered running barefoot through fields, chasing bees with a mix of fear and fascination, my mother calling from the kitchen window, the scent of fresh bread and coffee hanging in the air. I thought of my teenage years, when I first learned that hard work could transform curiosity into craft. The thrill of discovering a queen laying her first brood, the satisfaction of a hive thriving under my care. It all felt alive in my chest, even now. Every sting I'd suffered seemed worth it for the lessons it carried. Then came adulthood, The whirlwind of marriage, children, and the responsibilities that weighed heavily, yet gave life its richest texture. I remembered the sleepless nights of tending sick hives while my children cried for attention, and the mornings of quiet joy when Emily or Daniel's laughter filled the air over golden frames of honey. The ache and joy were inseparable, like the sweetness and sting of the hives themselves. I also recalled the betrayals, the Frank who left with my contacts, the seasons when entire colonies died unexpectedly. Those moments had cut deep, but in retrospect they sharpened me, forced me to adapt, and taught me the resilience that carried me through decades of labor and love. And through it all, there was Susan, steadfast, patient, ever-present. She had carried much of the unseen weight, and now, in these quiet moments, I could truly appreciate how we had built everything together: a home, a family, a legacy, and a life that mattered. I realized that life, much like beekeeping, is a delicate balance. There are highs and lows.
Daniel and Emily returned often, their children running through the fields, sticky from honey and mud, curious eyes wide as they learned about bees the way I once had. I showed them how to hold a frame gently, how to read the subtle language of the colony. I saw myself in them, the same awe, the same thrill of discovery, and I felt an immense pride, knowing that a piece of my life would continue through them. I reflected on the years, on the hardships, the betrayals, the stings, both literal and metaphorical. I remembered the exhaustion of long days, the ache of my back, the weight of responsibility, and the uncertainty of every season. But alongside that were the victories, the gratitude of strangers and neighbors, the laughter of my children, the deep, sustaining love of Susan, and the lessons of patience, resilience, and devotion the bees had taught me. Sitting there in the evening light, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of completeness. I had lived fully, loved deeply, worked hard, and left something lasting behind. My life, like the hives, had its cycles, moments of sweetness and moments of sting. But in the end, it was rich, meaningful, and mine. I smiled, thinking of that first jar of honey I ever held as a boy, and of every jar that followed. Every frame, every sting, every hum had led me here, to a life I wouldn't trade for anything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in warm golds and ambers, I felt profoundly, deeply grateful. I had lived, I had loved, I had tended the hives of my world, and I was at peace. The hum of the bees was quiet now, but it would never leave me, and neither would the sweetness of a life well lived.